Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to ancient Rome. No fluffy mattresses or cozy blankets, just stone walls and cold nights. You're about to endure a night in a Roman home, and trust me, you probably won't survive it. I mean, we're talking about a time where sleep wasn't the cushy modern experience you enjoy today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. I love hearing about all the places you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing in a typical Roman home, looking around at the rough stone walls that trap the night's chill. The floors are made of hard-packed earth, and there's no plush carpet to sink your feet into. You've probably never spent a night in a house quite like this, and let me tell you, no mattress, no blankets, no pillows, and no modern comforts. But here you are, in ancient Rome, ready to sleep. Just how does one survive such a night? To start, there's no soft bed to sink into. Roman homes, even the wealthier ones, were often pretty sparse when it came to comforts. The wealthy might have had a mattress filled with soft wool or feathers, but even that wouldn't compare to the thick plush beds we have today. Instead of blankets, you're relying on whatever clothing you have, wrapped tightly to stay warm through the night. Now, historians still argue whether Romans actually slept better than we think, considering they didn't have the distractions of modern life. No phones, no binge watching. Some believe that Roman sleep was more natural, more in tune with the body's rhythms. But, I'll be honest, it's hard to imagine anyone sleeping soundly on a floor without a bed to rest on. You're probably wondering, what did they sleep on? Well, it wasn't just the hard floor. Romans slept on a variety of surfaces. Most common was a basic mattress, if you were lucky. If you were really lucky, it might have been stuffed with wool or even feathers. If you weren't so fortunate, you'd be sleeping on a thin layer of straw or cloth, not exactly the coziest setup. And if you're imagining a nice, soft feather bed, think again. The rich might have had something akin to a soft mattress, but even their sleep setup was more about practicality than luxury. Now, this was ancient Rome. There weren't any electric heaters to keep you warm either. You might have been lucky enough to have a fire in the corner of the room, but this wasn't like modern central heating. The flames would die down by nightfall, leaving you with just your clothes and a few layers of fabric to shield you from the cold. Remember, you're now wrapped in whatever cloth you have on hand, maybe a tunic or a simple woolen blanket, but nothing nearly as warm or comfortable as today's bedding. And speaking of chilly nights, without proper insulation or modern comforts, you'd probably feel the full force of winter. The nights could be unbearably cold, and all you can do is curl up tighter and pray you make it through. The real kicker, though? The Romans didn't sleep like we do either. Their sleep patterns were more segmented. Rather than a solid 8 hours of sleep, Romans often broke their sleep into two parts, a first and second sleep. You drift off to sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night. And this wasn't unusual. People would spend time in between their sleep periods, maybe reading or chatting in a quieter, calmer part of the night. Imagine the contrast between then and now, when you're used to turning in for a solid chunk of rest. Historians still debate whether this pattern helped or hindered their sleep quality. Some suggest the wakeful period might have been a natural, peaceful interlude, while others think it disrupted their rest entirely. Either way, you can imagine how odd it would be to wake up in the middle of the night and try to fall back asleep. The whole idea of sleeping in ancient Rome feels strange. I mean, you'd be lying down on a hard surface in a cold room, with only the faint glow of an oil lamp or the dying embers of a fire to keep you company. The absence of a cozy blanket is enough to make you appreciate what you've got today. But this was a reality for the Romans, whether they were wealthy or poor. And as night falls in Rome, you're left with a sense of how different their world was from ours. No fluffy pillows, no soft sheets, just a hard floor, the chill of the night air, and whatever clothing you had to keep warm. As the night stretches on, you settle into what can only be described as an uncomfortable situation. You've got your thin layer of straw, cloth, or maybe even a mattress stuffed with wool or feathers. It's not the luxury you're used to in the 21st century, where a mattress is just a click away. But here, in ancient Rome, you make do with what you have. At least you have something to lie on, unlike the poor souls who had nothing but the bare earth beneath them. You're trying to sleep, but the cold stone floor is unrelenting. Your bed is barely more than a mat, and the chilly night air cuts through any layers you've piled on. The Romans didn't know what central heating was. They didn't even know what an electric blanket was, and you might find yourself wishing for one. Instead, Romans used whatever they could find to stay warm, often huddling together for warmth or relying on a small fire in the room. But these fires were usually small, contained in an oil lamp or brazier, and often barely enough to keep the cold at bay. And even if you were fortunate enough to have a fire, it wasn't like the modern warmth we take for granted. The fire wouldn't last through the night, and when it flickered out, you were left in the dark, shivering. Now, let's talk about the pillows, or rather, the lack of them. The Romans didn't have fluffy pillows like we do today. Instead, they used small, hard headrests. Imagine using a rock as a pillow. That's closer to the truth. You might have a simple cloth pillow filled with straw, but nothing like the downy, soft pillows we dream of today. But, believe it or not, Romans actually preferred these hard pillows. They didn't want to be too comfortable. The hard headrests were thought to keep their heads upright during sleep, preventing them from drooping and causing headaches. As odd as it sounds, it was just another example of the Romans' unique approach to sleep. Historians still argue about the exact benefits of these hard headrests. Some believe that they were simply practical, keeping the head in a better position to avoid neck pain or misalignment. Others argue that they were a status symbol, something that only the wealthy could afford. Either way, you find yourself adjusting to the hard, uncomfortable rest. You're trying to get some sleep, but the lack of comfort is wearing on you. Imagine how difficult it must have been for the Romans, who didn't have the luxuries of our modern world to fall back on. You start to doze off, but your mind races. You're still not sure how people could sleep like this. The Romans, however, seemed to get used to it. Maybe they were just tougher than we are today. Or maybe, as some scholars argue, the discomfort was simply a part of life in ancient Rome. They didn't know what they were missing. Sleep, for the Romans, was not the escape we think of today. It wasn't a time to curl up and forget about the world. Instead, sleep was just another part of daily life, something that happened in between the hustle and bustle of Roman society. Without modern comforts, sleep in ancient Rome was far from restful, and the Romans had to be resilient to survive it. But you're starting to feel the weight of it now. The hard floor, the cold air, and the thin fabric around you, it all adds up. As you lay there, you think about how you might never take a mattress or a blanket for granted again. You also realize that your body is reacting to this discomfort. You're tossing and turning more than usual, trying to find a more comfortable position, but there's nowhere to go. The Romans had a saying, if you want to sleep well, make sure you've worked hard all day. And they did work hard, from dawn till dusk. There wasn't much time to think about comfort when you were busy with daily life, and that mindset helped the Romans power through their physically demanding lives. But you're struggling. You wish you had a modern mattress, a soft blanket, maybe even a heating pad, but none of that exists in ancient Rome. Instead, you're left to make do, just as the Romans did. Still, sleep isn't just about comfort. For the Romans, it was also a time for dreams. They believed that sleep was connected to the divine, and the gods sometimes sent messages through dreams. They didn't have the scientific understanding we do today, so dreams were seen as omens, visions, or even warnings. Could your fitful sleep be connected to the gods? Perhaps. But more likely, you're just wishing for a better pillow. Despite the discomfort, sleep eventually comes. It's not the deep, uninterrupted sleep we're accustomed to today. Instead, you drift in and out of consciousness, aware of the cold, aware of the hard surface beneath you. But eventually, your body gives in to the fatigue, and you fall asleep, the sounds of the city outside fading into the background. Historians still debate how much rest the Romans actually got. Some argue that their sleep patterns, segmented into two parts, might have helped them rest more effectively. Others think that the constant discomfort and the demands of daily life meant they never truly got the sleep they needed. Either way, you're in for a restless night, and as the night drags on, you realize just how different the ancient world was from your own. As the hours creep by, you find yourself growing more and more restless. The cold air seeps into your bones, and the stone floor beneath you feels like it's pressing up into your body. You turn and shift, hoping for some small hint of comfort, but there's nothing. Every movement seems to remind you just how uncomfortable this whole situation really is. You're stuck in ancient Rome, without the luxury of soft bedding, fluffy pillows, or any of the modern comforts we've come to expect. In the absence of comfort, your mind begins to wander. The Romans were used to this kind of life, but how did they manage it? Were they just built differently? Did they somehow find peace in the discomfort, or were they constantly longing for something better? Historians still debate whether ancient Romans ever truly got the restful sleep we crave today. Some believe that their segmented sleep patterns, sleeping in 2 shifts, might have helped them sleep more effectively. Others argue that the lack of comfort and the constant demands of daily life meant that most Romans probably had trouble sleeping. You begin to think about the idea of segmented sleep, something that was more common in ancient times than it is today. In ancient Rome, it wasn't unusual for people to sleep in 2 shifts, the first sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness, then the second sleep. During the wakeful period, people might read, write, or even visit neighbors. This wasn't considered abnormal, it was simply part of Roman life. In fact, many Romans believed that the middle of the night was a sacred time, a moment when dreams and omens could visit them. Imagine waking up in the dead of night and thinking, what message are the gods trying to send me? You're lying on the cold floor, eyes wide open, thinking about all this. But your eyes grow heavy again, and you slip into that strange first sleep. It's shallow, restless, interrupted by the hard surface beneath you. You dream, if you can call it that, of Roman gods and omens. The gods, according to Roman belief, could communicate through dreams, and it was considered wise to interpret them. But, honestly, your dreams are more like a collection of fragmented thoughts, swirling and indistinct. The idea that dreams were a doorway to the divine was deeply ingrained in Roman culture. It's funny to think that, despite being so uncomfortable, you're now connected to the very people who believed that sleep wasn't just about rest. Romans didn't simply sleep to recover their energy, they saw it as a gateway to divine insight. If you had a bad night's sleep, it was often interpreted as a sign that the gods were unhappy with you. But, when you wake from your fragmented sleep, you can't help but think that maybe the gods were simply upset by your decision to lie down on a hard floor with no blanket. As the night drags on, the fire in the room grows dim. The small embers flicker weakly, barely keeping the chill at bay. It's not enough to truly warm you, and you find yourself longing for the heat of modern blankets or an electric heater. But this was ancient Rome. They didn't have the luxury of these modern conveniences. What they did have, however, was a set of customs that helped them endure. The Romans didn't just sleep, they found ways to adapt. One way they coped with the cold was by huddling together. While not everyone would sleep in the same room, families often shared close quarters, and the warmth of bodies pressing together helped mitigate the chill. But even that wasn't a guarantee of comfort. If you were unlucky enough to be sleeping alone, it was just you and the cold. No fluffy duvet to curl into, no extra layer of warmth to shield you. Historians often debate just how much discomfort the Romans actually experienced during their nightly rest. Some believe that, for the most part, Romans accepted this discomfort as part of life. After all, their homes were designed to keep the cold out in the winter, but they weren't equipped for real warmth. In fact, most homes in ancient Rome had no central heating. Instead, families used simple space heaters, or braziers, to provide warmth, but these didn't work particularly well at night. The lack of blankets and heated beds made sleep even more difficult. Even the wealthy, who lived in larger homes, were not exempt from this discomfort. While they might have had access to slightly better mattresses, perhaps stuffed with feathers or wool, their homes weren't much warmer than those of the poorer citizens. The fire, which may have been a luxury to some, would eventually go out, leaving the room cold and dark. And so, as the hours drag on, you lie there, trying to get some rest, knowing that the night will eventually come to an end. You begin to think that maybe you're not as tough as the Romans. Maybe they were just accustomed to discomfort. But, as the night wears on and your body adjusts to the cold and hardness beneath you, you can't help but feel a strange sense of connection with the people of ancient Rome. They endured hardships that we can hardly imagine, and yet they survived. Perhaps their strength came from the very discomfort we now dread. As the night deepens, you begin to notice something curious. The sounds of the city, which seemed so distant at first, now seem almost close. The streets of ancient Rome were far from silent, and even in the dead of night there was life, shuffling feet, the chatter of late-night vendors, the clinking of pots and pans. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that ancient Rome didn't have the quiet, peaceful nights we associate with sleep today. People lived in close quarters, and the noise of the city could be both a comfort and a curse. Just outside the window, you might hear the distant cry of an animal, perhaps the neighing of a horse or the low bleat of a goat. Ancient Romans weren't accustomed to complete silence. In fact, some scholars suggest that Roman citizens might have been so used to the sounds of their city that it became part of their sleep cycle. A constant hum of life outside their windows, like the soft murmurs of a distant crowd, may have acted as a kind of white noise, helping them drift off in the chaos of the world. Still, the noises of the night aren't exactly soothing for you. Every crackle of a branch outside or scuffle of feet below seems to make it harder to relax, and the light from the small fire in the room isn't enough to mask the darkness. In fact, the absence of proper lighting would have been a huge factor in the Romans' nighttime routines. They didn't have the electric bulbs or streetlights we rely on today. Instead, their only source of light came from oil lamps or candles. Even those were expensive and often too dim to light up a room for any extended period. You start thinking about how different your experience would be if you were one of the wealthy Romans who could afford luxuries like better lighting, perhaps even a softer mattress or more heated rooms. But for most Romans, life was a bit more rudimentary. The poor lived in small, crowded apartments called insulae, which were made of wood and stone. These buildings were known to be noisy, cramped, and often poorly insulated from the cold. The wealthier citizens had more space, but their homes weren't much warmer in the winter. You wonder how they managed the discomfort of it all. Were they just tougher, or did they simply accept their circumstances? Historians still argue about this. Some claim that the Romans were more resilient than modern people, accustomed to enduring hardship without complaint. Others believe that the lack of comfort might have contributed to their famously short lifespans, with diseases, poor hygiene, and lack of rest taking their toll. Even in wealthy households, life wasn't as cushioned as we might imagine. There were no thick duvets or plush mattresses, and the bedding was often sparse and simple. You would likely have slept with a thin woolen blanket, not much more than a piece of fabric that offered minimal warmth against the cold stone floor. Wealthy Romans would have used finer sheets made from linen or silk, but nothing like the modern comfort you might expect. But the fragmented sleep pattern could come with its own set of challenges. For one, it meant that people had to adapt to being awake in the middle of the night. This wasn't always easy. The Romans didn't have phones or books to keep them entertained in the dead of night. Instead, they might have had to entertain themselves with deep thoughts, personal reflections, or even prayer. Some Romans also believed that their dreams were an important source of wisdom. There were even trained dream interpreters who could help decode the messages sent by the gods through sleep. You can't help but feel a bit disconnected from this ancient way of living. You're used to sleeping through the night, uninterrupted with the comforts of your modern life. But here you are in ancient Rome, trying to make sense of a night that feels endless without the help of electric lighting, a cozy blanket, or even a decent pillow. The Romans didn't have the luxury of comfort, and their sleep was often interrupted by the sounds of the city, the demands of life, or the gods themselves. Historians still argue about how much of an impact all these factors had on Roman life. Were they really sleep deprived, or did their lifestyle just make them more attuned to the rhythms of the natural world? Maybe it's the lack of comfort, the constant background noise, or simply the harshness of ancient life that made sleep in Rome such a different experience than what we have today. Whatever the case may be, you're now drifting in and out of consciousness, wondering how the Romans ever managed to get any rest at all. As the night lingers, you start to feel a deeper understanding of what it meant to sleep in ancient Rome. The discomfort is no longer just about the cold or the hard floor. It's about the lack of control over your environment. In modern times, we can regulate the temperature, adjust our pillows, and choose the perfect blanket. But in ancient Rome, your comfort was dictated by the world around you, and much of that world was beyond your control. You've now spent what feels like hours lying here, with no hope of an easy sleep, but that wasn't uncommon in ancient Rome. The Romans didn't have the same understanding of sleep cycles that we do today. In fact, they probably didn't have much of a concept of restful sleep at all. For them, sleep was a necessary inconvenience, and they made do with whatever their living situation provided. They didn't expect to lie down and drift off easily. They knew that sleep in the ancient world was a battle, one fought on hard floors with little warmth and no guarantee of comfort. As you begin to drift in and out of sleep, you can almost hear the distant sounds of Roman life, people moving in the streets, the clattering of carts, the murmur of conversations. The noise isn't soothing. Instead, it serves as a constant reminder that there's no peace to be found. You try to ignore it, but the sounds creep in, reminding you that the Romans were never really able to fully escape their noisy world. In fact, many Roman homes, especially those in the poorer parts of the city, were built in such a way that privacy was hard to come by. The walls were thin, and the sounds of everyday life could filter through, making it nearly impossible to find quiet. Even when you went to sleep, you could never fully escape the world. The ancient Romans, for all their greatness, weren't immune to the same struggles that we face today. They didn't have luxury hotels or quiet suburban homes. Their living conditions were often cramped, noisy, and uncomfortable. Most homes in ancient Rome were built in insulae, or apartment blocks, where multiple families lived in close quarters. The noise of the city, the people, and the animals would have been a constant presence. You're lying here in the cold, your mind wandering, trying to picture just how overwhelming the constant hum of Roman life must have been. Perhaps it wasn't as bad as you think, though. Maybe the Romans learned to adapt to their surroundings. They didn't expect silence, so they found peace in the chaos. The sounds of the city might have been unsettling at first, but for Romans, it was just part of the rhythm of life. You think about the times when you've been in a noisy place and how you eventually got used to it, even found comfort in it. The Romans were resilient in that way. They didn't expect the same level of comfort we do today. They worked with what they had. Even their beds, sparse and simple as they were, could be adapted for the unique Roman lifestyle. Instead of a traditional bed frame, Romans often slept on raised platforms or low couches called lectae. These weren't comfortable by modern standards. There were no plush mattresses or soft duvets, but they were functional, and for the Romans, that was enough. The lectae were designed for practicality, not luxury. You didn't have a choice about your comfort level, you just made do. You would lie on a thin mattress, maybe filled with straw, or perhaps you would sleep directly on a simple rug. There was no adjusting the bed, no fluffing the pillow. It was just what it was. Roman beds were designed for more than sleep. They were multifunctional, often serving as places to relax, socialize, and eat. The more lavish homes might have had a bed placed in a triclinium, a dining room, where reclining on these beds was a part of the meal experience. In fact, dining and sleeping were intertwined in a way we find hard to imagine today. But for the Romans, the idea of lounging on a bed wasn't solely about sleep. It was part of their everyday life. Perhaps that's part of the reason they didn't expect comfort the way we do. Sleep was just another part of their busy, social, and often noisy lives. Now, you begin to realize that your discomfort is tied to more than just the hard stone beneath you. It's the realization that this ancient world wasn't built for your modern sensibilities. The Romans didn't have the luxury of quiet nights or temperature-controlled rooms. Their world was much harsher, and sleep was a small but important part of their survival in a world full of challenges. It wasn't about drifting off into a peaceful slumber. It was about managing to get through the night, waking up to face another day in the bustling city of Rome. Even as you struggle to find sleep, you can't help but appreciate the resilience of the Romans. They had a way of adapting to their world that's hard for us to understand. They didn't have the comforts we take for granted, but they made do. And perhaps that's the lesson of tonight's journey, that we too can survive discomfort, no matter how harsh it may seem. You may not have a warm blanket or a soft bed, but you are still here, experiencing a slice of ancient Roman life, just as they did in all its uncomfortable glory. By now, the night feels longer than you anticipated. Time seems to stretch as you lie awake, trying to settle into a rhythm. In this quiet space of discomfort, a realization dawns on you. Sleeping in ancient Rome wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was a mental game too. You have to adjust to the idea that rest was something the Romans couldn't fully escape. Unlike modern sleep, which is considered sacred and undisturbed, in ancient Rome, the concept of sleep was fragmented and far less private. In the absence of modern conveniences, the Romans found ways to make the best of their situations. For the average Roman, a good night's rest was rarely uninterrupted. You would have been just as likely to wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of street vendors setting up shop as to a neighbor arguing over a noise complaint. Romans weren't accustomed to the luxury of quiet, uninterrupted nights, and that reality shaped how they slept, or rather, how they didn't. This lack of uninterrupted rest might have made them more resilient, but it also contributed to the societal pressures of the time. Roman homes didn't come with doors and walls that ensured total privacy. If you lived in a crowded insula, You would have shared your living space with several other families. Your neighbors' conversations, their cooking smells, the sounds of children playing, and perhaps even arguments would have drifted into your room, disturbing whatever semblance of peace you might have hoped for. No cozy corners or quiet, solitary retreats existed for the average Roman. There was no real escape. Even in the wealthier homes, sleep wasn't always a private affair. The triclinium, the dining area where Romans reclined while eating, was also a place for relaxation and sometimes even sleeping. In some wealthy homes, you might find your family or friends gathered around after a long day, discussing politics, the latest news, or perhaps gossip, while lying on the same surface used for meals. The idea of a private space for sleep simply didn't exist. Family and social life mixed seamlessly into the space where you were supposed to rest. You were expected to interact even during the most sacred moments of sleep. Historians still argue whether this constant communal aspect of Roman life was seen as a positive feature or an inevitable consequence of overcrowded living conditions. Some believe the Romans embraced the social aspects of their home life, feeling a sense of closeness and support. After all, what's a few noisy arguments or bustling activity when you have your loved ones close by? Others, however, argue that this lack of privacy added to the stress of Roman life, leaving little room for personal reflection or restful solitude. You can't help but wonder how different things would be if you were living in a quieter, more solitary time. Perhaps if you were a wealthy Roman with access to a private villa in the countryside, the nights might have been more peaceful. Instead of worrying about the noise of the city, you could sleep in a room dedicated to relaxation, surrounded by nature and the gentle sounds of birds and flowing water. For a few moments, your mind drifts to this peaceful alternative, the idea of lying in soft, peaceful solitude with no distractions. But the reality of ancient Roman life doesn't offer this luxury. Instead, you are once again confronted by the sounds of the city around you. The distant call of a vendor hawking their wares, the rhythmic sound of foot traffic, and the occasional shout of someone in the street are all reminders that you are living within the pulse of the city, and there is no escape from its demands. You try to focus on the fleeting sounds, trying to find comfort in the hum of the city, but it's not enough. Your mind refuses to rest, and the longer you lie awake, the more you begin to consider just how much your body is impacted by these environmental factors. You can't help but think back to the ancient Romans, who, in many ways, had to live with the same frustrations. The Romans didn't have the luxury of noise-canceling headphones or earbuds to block out the sound. Instead, they had to learn to live with it, to adapt to the rhythm of the city around them. They didn't have a choice in the matter. They were born into a world that demanded constant engagement. But perhaps that's the real beauty of ancient Roman life, their ability to endure. They didn't expect peaceful, silent nights. They made do with what they had, and in many ways, they thrived in a world that we can only imagine today. They learned to sleep not in the stillness of a quiet bedroom, but in the chaos of a bustling city. Perhaps there's something to be said for this, for finding peace in discomfort, for learning to sleep not in solitude, but within the hum of life itself. Historians still debate whether the Romans were truly resilient in their approach to life. Did they embrace the noise and the lack of privacy, or did they long for something more tranquil, like the private retreats we take for granted today? We may never know for sure, but one thing is clear. Their ability to adapt to their noisy, crowded world allowed them to accomplish some of the greatest feats in human history. And perhaps, if you can take anything from this experience, it's the lesson that even in the most uncomfortable, inconvenient of circumstances, you can find a way to survive. As the night deepens, you begin to feel the weight of ancient Rome's lifestyle pressing upon you. Sleep is elusive, and with each passing hour, the discomfort grows. But now, you realize that perhaps the struggle to find rest isn't just physical. It's symbolic of something deeper, something ingrained in Roman society itself. Sleep in the ancient world wasn't just about lying down and resting. It was about making the best of a difficult, demanding existence. It wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. For the average Roman, the ability to sleep wasn't a given. It was a skill honed by necessity. The Roman world was one of constant motion, noise, and change. People woke early to start their long days. There was work to be done, errands to run, markets to visit, and tasks that couldn't wait. It wasn't a world that allowed for lazy mornings or leisurely naps. The very concept of sleeping in was alien to the Romans. They didn't have the luxury of sleeping as much as they wanted, whenever they wanted. No, sleep was something you fought for. The Romans understood that sleep, though essential, was not always restful. Their bodies were subjected to the rhythms of their environment, which was always bustling with life. If you were lucky, your day might end with some quiet relaxation. If you were unlucky, your night would be filled with noise and distractions. Even wealthy Romans who lived in the comfort of villas couldn't escape the struggles of sleep. Whether in the city or the countryside, the Romans lived in a world where their rest was often interrupted. While their homes might have offered some degree of comfort, they still had to deal with the realities of a noisy, ever-changing world. Even more interesting is the way Romans dealt with this lack of restful sleep. They had remedies, some practical, others a little more unusual. For example, Romans believed in the power of certain foods and drinks to help them sleep. One of the most famous was a drink made from boiled turnips, which they believed had calming properties. While the modern research might not support the effectiveness of turnips for sleep, the Romans swore by it. Historians still argue whether these early sleep aids were simply placebo effects or if they had actual benefits, but regardless of their effectiveness, they show us just how deeply the Romans were aware of the challenges of sleep and how they sought to overcome them. On the other hand, you're likely more familiar with the idea of using wine to help you sleep. Wine was a staple of the Roman diet, and many believed it had the power to induce sleep. While the average Roman didn't have access to the fine wines that the wealthy enjoyed, they still knew that a cup of wine could help them unwind after a long, stressful day. Some Roman medical texts even recommend mixing wine with herbs like poppy seeds to create a more potent sleep potion. And while you might be tempted to dismiss these remedies as mere superstition, remember that even today, we turn to herbal teas or sleeping pills to help us get some rest. The Romans didn't just rely on food and drink, though. They also practiced various rituals to help them sleep. Before bed, they would often engage in relaxing activities like bathing, reading, or playing musical instruments. A soothing bath, in particular, was seen as a way to prepare the body for sleep. The ancient Romans were well known for their love of baths, and the public baths in Roman cities were often lavish affairs. They weren't just places to wash up, they were places to relax, socialize, and prepare for rest. In a way, the Roman bathhouse functioned as a precursor to our modern-day spas. However, this kind of relaxation was not available to everyone. Wealthier Romans had the luxury of bathhouses and private retreats, but for the poorer citizens, these comforts were out of reach. They didn't have the option to soak in a warm bath after a long day, or take part in a luxurious social gathering. Instead, they had to make do with what they had. Sleep, for them, was a simple, practical matter. You start to feel the weight of their resilience pressing down on you as the night wears on. In a strange way, you begin to appreciate the discomfort. It's a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, people find ways to adapt, to thrive, and to survive. The Romans didn't have the comfort of soft beds, warm blankets, or the peace and quiet of modern life, but they found ways to make it work. And perhaps in that, there's a lesson for you about endurance, about resilience, and about the power of adapting to the world around you, no matter how uncomfortable it may seem. The hours slip by, and the Roman night is still far from peaceful. As you lie there in the stillness, your mind wanders back to the physical aspects of life in ancient Rome. You begin to think more about the ways the Romans interacted with their environment, both in their waking hours and while trying to sleep. The discomfort you're feeling in this moment is a stark reminder of the simplicity of their lives. They didn't have the luxury of soft mattresses or quiet, serene spaces. Their existence was much more basic, practical, and filled with hard edges. The idea of comfort, as you know it, was nearly foreign to the average Roman. While the wealthy had access to luxuries like plush couches, elegant furniture, and imported linens, the majority of Romans lived in far humbler circumstances. You can't help but think of the insulae, the crowded apartment buildings where most of Rome's population resided. These structures were notoriously cramped and often poorly constructed. Families, sometimes multiple ones, shared small rooms that were barely larger than a modern-day closet. The walls were thin, the floors uneven, and privacy was a rare commodity. Even if you had a small bed, it would be little more than a mattress stuffed with straw or wool, laid directly on the floor. Sleep was hardly a relaxing affair for those living in these conditions. In contrast, the wealthy Romans had their domus, private homes that were usually spacious, with courtyards, gardens, and even personal rooms for sleeping. These houses offered more in terms of comfort and privacy, but even the rich couldn't fully escape the practical realities of Roman life. There were still no central heating systems or quiet, isolated rooms for complete rest. The wealthy often had larger, more intricate sleeping arrangements, like raised platforms where they reclined on pillows, but even they weren't spared from the challenges of living in a bustling city like Rome. The Romans, as a society, didn't value relaxation in the way we do today. Their days were filled with work, public duties, and social obligations, leaving little room for the kind of downtime we've come to expect in the modern world. They didn't have the luxury of lazy Sundays or weekend retreats. For the average Roman, sleep wasn't just a time to rest. It was part of a larger routine that involved getting up early, working hard, and attending to the demands of the empire. If you were a Roman citizen, your life was marked by a sense of duty, a constant movement from one task to another. This relentless pace was ingrained in Roman society. Sleep was not viewed as a precious respite from the world, but as a necessary function to keep going, to continue fulfilling your responsibilities. Even in the wealthier households, rest was often considered secondary to the demands of politics, business, or socializing. In fact, many Roman elites would sleep in shifts or take short naps throughout the day to make sure they could keep up with the demands of their busy lives. This practice of segmented sleep was quite common in the ancient world. People didn't necessarily sleep for a full 8 hours in a row. Instead, they would rest for a few hours, wake up in the middle of the night, and then sleep again later. This way, they could still tend to their personal duties and get the necessary rest they needed to function. Historians still debate the effectiveness of segmented sleep. Some believe it was an adaptation to the lifestyle of ancient Rome, where privacy and rest were hard to come by. Others argue that it was simply a byproduct of poor living conditions, where the disruptions of urban life and the lack of comfortable sleeping arrangements led to this irregular sleeping pattern. Either way, it was a part of life for the Romans, and it's a reminder that their approach to sleep was vastly different from our modern sensibilities. You start to realize that what you think of as a basic human need, undisturbed sleep, was not so basic in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, people didn't just have to deal with discomfort, they had to adapt to it. You find yourself thinking about the Roman Via, the roads that stretched across the empire like veins, carrying goods, soldiers, and travelers from one city to the next. These roads were vital for the empire's success, but they were also a constant source of noise, dust, and chaos. You can imagine what it would have been like to sleep near one of these roads with the sound of carts rolling by, horses neighing, and the occasional shouting of merchants or soldiers. Even the most peaceful corner of a Roman home would have been filled with the sounds of a bustling empire. And then, there's the question of cleanliness. You'd be hard-pressed to find an ancient Roman who didn't deal with the realities of dirt, dust, and the occasional unpleasant odor. Romans were aware of personal hygiene and took regular baths, but that didn't mean their homes were pristine. Without modern plumbing or sanitation systems, homes were subject to the same environmental hazards that affected the streets: filth, rodents, and the ever-present smell of the crowded urban environment. It's easy to see how these conditions could have contributed to a sense of unease or discomfort when trying to sleep. You begin to think about the Roman approach to health and wellness, especially in the realm of sleep. They had some fascinating remedies to deal with the various ailments that affected their sleep, from insomnia to aches and pains. For instance, some Romans used essential oils, like lavender or rosemary, to calm their minds and promote relaxation. Others believed in the power of certain amulets or charms to ward off bad dreams. Still, even with all these remedies, the idea of a truly restful, uninterrupted night's sleep was something that most Romans could only dream of. They lived in a world where comfort and rest were hard-won luxuries, and sleep was just one more challenge to face in an already demanding life. The contrast between your modern, cushioned life and the realities of Roman existence begins to sink in. While you're tucked in bed, surrounded by pillows, blankets, and the quiet hum of the world outside, the Romans were braving their own version of sleep deprivation. It was a constant struggle, one that they had to accept as a part of life. In some ways, this resilience, this ability to carry on despite the discomfort, is a testament to their strength. As the night wears on, you realize that there's something to be said for their ability to adapt, to sleep not in comfort, but in the midst of a world that never truly rested. Perhaps there's a lesson here. Sleep, like life, isn't always about perfection. It's about making the best of what you have, even when the world around you is far from ideal. In a way, the Romans taught us that the art of sleeping isn't just about comfort, it's about resilience. The minutes are slipping by, and the night deepens further, yet rest still eludes you. It's in these moments that you start to grasp just how intertwined sleep and work were in the Roman world. For the Romans, sleep wasn't a luxury that could be separated from the grind of daily life. It was deeply connected to the demands of society, which expected its citizens to stay active, vigilant, and productive. You begin to see how the relentless pace of Roman life was reflected in their sleep habits. In a society where everyone, from the poorest plebeian to the wealthiest patrician, was expected to contribute, there was little time for rest. Work was not just about earning a living, it was a form of duty, and sleep was something you had to fight for, not something you were freely given. Even the Roman slaves who served their masters tirelessly didn't get the luxury of uninterrupted rest. Historians still argue about the specifics of slave life, but one thing is clear: they worked long hours, often with little respite. Their nights were likely filled with discomfort, not just because of their physical labor, but because they too lived in cramped, noisy quarters, which further disrupted their sleep. And it wasn't just the workday that was exhausting. The Roman calendar was packed with festivals, religious ceremonies, and public events, all of which demanded participation. Sleep in these circumstances was more of an afterthought. When people did manage to find rest, it was often short-lived, a fleeting escape from the demands of the day. Even during the nighttime hours, it wasn't uncommon for the street sounds of Roman cities to creep into homes, keeping people from falling into deep, restful slumber. However, sleep was not just something the Romans struggled with in terms of their daily schedules. It was also a matter of safety and security. Living in a city as large as Rome meant that danger was always lurking, whether in the form of thieves, political unrest, or the ever-present threat of fire. The safety of one's home wasn't guaranteed, and Roman citizens had to take precautions to protect themselves and their families. As a result, even when they did manage to rest, their sleep was often fragmented by fears of invasion or the sounds of the city's unpredictable nature. Sleep in Rome wasn't about quiet, peaceful respite. It was about getting what you could, whenever you could, in the middle of a world that never truly stopped moving. In these moments, you think about how much of modern life we take for granted. Our homes, our quiet neighborhoods, our safe and comfortable beds. These are luxuries that the Romans didn't enjoy. Their sleep was always disrupted by something: the clamor of the marketplace, the chatter of their neighbors, the sounds of city life. Even the wealthiest Romans weren't immune to this. They could afford the finest furniture, the most expensive linens, and the best food. But they still lived in a world that was loud, busy, and constantly moving. This unrelenting pace of life meant that sleep was always fleeting, never guaranteed. Now, you reflect on the Romans' approach to sleep with a new sense of understanding. They had to make do with what they had, using the tools and rituals at their disposal to find moments of rest. They weren't as concerned with creating the perfect sleep environment as we are today. Instead, they focused on surviving each day and finding whatever rest they could in between. This mindset, this constant push to keep moving forward, is what made the Roman Empire so successful. They were a people who didn't stop for rest. They worked, fought, and lived with purpose, all while adapting to the realities of their environment. This constant motion was reflected not just in their work, but in their social lives as well. Socializing in Rome was a full-time job. The elite spent hours hosting dinner parties, attending public events, and participating in elaborate celebrations. Even when they were technically off-duty, they still had responsibilities to their peers, to their families, and to the state. Sleep wasn't just about personal comfort, it was about fulfilling these societal obligations. As a result, the wealthiest Romans were often just as sleep-deprived as the poor, caught up in a never-ending cycle of activity that left little room for relaxation. Even the typical Roman sleep schedule was unlike what you would expect today. The idea of a solid, uninterrupted 8 hours of sleep was unheard of. Romans often practiced biphasic sleep, which meant they would sleep in 2 segments. The first sleep typically began shortly after sundown and lasted a few hours. Then they would wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or so, often engaging in quiet activities like reading, writing, or even visiting neighbors. After this period of wakefulness, they would return to sleep until the morning. This split sleep pattern was a natural response to the noise, light, and activity of the city. Historians are still divided on whether this pattern was something people chose out of necessity or if it was simply a result of the environment in which they lived. As the night stretches on, you start to think about the contrast between how the Romans lived and how you live now. The luxury of a quiet, undisturbed night's sleep, free from the worries of the world, feels like an almost impossible dream when you consider the Roman experience. The ancient Romans didn't have our comfortable homes or our modern sleep aids. They didn't have the same quiet nights filled with gentle dreams. Instead, they had the noisy, chaotic world around them, and they adapted, making the best of their circumstances. Your eyes start to grow heavy, and as you drift further into the quiet, the notion of Roman resilience begins to sink in. You start to realize that, while they didn't have the comfort you take for granted, they still managed to build an empire that lasted centuries. Their strength, endurance, and adaptability allowed them to thrive despite their challenging circumstances. And perhaps in the end, that's the lesson of Roman sleep. It's not about comfort, but about resilience and making the most of the world you're given. The night presses on, and you're starting to feel a curious sense of connection with the ancient Romans. Their world was one of perseverance, where the pursuit of rest and comfort was secondary to surviving each day and fulfilling their duties. Yet, despite the discomfort and the hardships they faced, the Romans had a sense of humor and cleverness that can still be felt in the remnants of their empire today. You think about how their ingenuity allowed them to create systems, structures, and practices that adapted to the challenges of their environment, and including how they approached sleep. On a practical level, Romans had another unique way of trying to achieve better rest. They employed various remedies to soothe themselves after long, hard days. The Romans were particularly fond of using pillow herbs, small sachets filled with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, and thyme. The Roman solution was rooted in nature, a way to bring the outside world inside, even as they lay down for the night. It's a reminder of how much the Romans valued the connection between nature and their daily lives, including sleep. The practice of using herbs to aid sleep was so prevalent that it became a part of Roman medicinal treatments. Physicians like Galen even wrote about the importance of sleep and how certain natural substances could help with relaxation. These medicinal remedies were often paired with more spiritual practices, like prayers to Somnus, creating a blend of practical and mystical approaches to rest. You can imagine how these remedies would have provided a sense of comfort for the Romans, knowing they had tools at their disposal to help them relax and unwind, even if only for a few hours. As you lie here, enveloped by the present-day comforts of your own bed, you realize that the Romans had to make do with far less. No modern bedding, no soft blankets, no pillow-top mattresses. Their sleep was an act of resilience, of making the best of what they had, whether it was a simple blanket, a handful of herbs, or a prayer to a god. And yet, they lived to conquer, to build empires, to create legacies that would outlast their sleep-deprived nights. The more you think about it, the more you realize that sleep in ancient Rome was never truly about relaxation. It was about finding moments of rest amidst a chaotic, ever-moving world. It wasn't a time to forget the pressures of daily life. It was a time to briefly reconnect with the divine, to center oneself before diving back into the noise of the empire. As the world outside your window remains quiet, the comparison feels striking. You've got a comfortable, cozy bed, but in ancient Rome, even sleep was a battle. The Romans didn't get to take a break, but perhaps, in a strange way, that's what makes their story so compelling. In the face of all this, they still found ways to rise. The hours stretch onward as you drift deeper into the night, and your mind wanders back to the very real fact that the Romans had to face not just the physical demands of life, but the psychological toll of a sleepless society. The fact is, the lack of sleep affected their health, their relationships, and their emotional well-being, but their approach to these struggles was remarkably different from our own. Whereas today we tend to view sleep deprivation as a health crisis, the Romans seemed to treat it as just another hurdle to overcome, something to be adapted to rather than fixed. You begin to think about how this relentless attitude toward both work and rest shaped not only their approach to sleep but to life itself. Historians debate whether the Romans' resistance to extended sleep was the result of their Stoic philosophy or simply a cultural norm. Some argue that their disdain for leisure and rest was rooted in their desire to maintain control over their bodies and minds. Others point to the practical aspects of Roman life, the busy streets, the political unrest, the constant work of the empire. In a city as crowded as Rome, sleep was always fleeting, and the Romans had to make do with what they could get. Your mind begins to wander to this idea of discipline and control. In a way, it's almost as if sleep was seen as something to be tamed, something that shouldn't overpower you, but instead be managed as part of a well-regulated life. As your body sinks deeper into your own comfortable bed, you think about how much control the Romans actually had over their own sleep. For them, the concept of good sleep hygiene didn't really exist. They didn't have blackout curtains, noise machines, or cool pillows to help them drift off. What they did have was a strong sense of duty, a belief that they could, and should, work through the discomfort of their surroundings, pushing through the mental and physical exhaustion of the day. You start to realize that this level of self-discipline would have been both a blessing and a curse. While it helped them accomplish incredible feats, it also meant that the pursuit of comfort was sacrificed in favor of productivity. This sense of constant striving makes you reflect on how you approach sleep today. In modern times, we're obsessed with comfort, adjusting the thermostat, fluffing the pillows, finding the perfect mattress. The Romans, on the other hand, were obsessed with purpose, with working through their exhaustion, with the idea that sleep was something to endure in the service of higher goals. It's a sobering thought. Now, as you drift deeper into the night, you realize that their sense of resilience offers a valuable lesson. It's not about waiting for perfect conditions to rest. It's about making the best of what you have. The Romans didn't have the luxury of quiet streets or soft mattresses, but they found ways to rest in their own unique way. And perhaps that's the true lesson of Roman sleep. Rest isn't about perfection. It's about finding balance and resilience in a world that doesn't always allow for it. You may not be in ancient Rome, but you too are adapting to your own environment, finding rest where you can, and learning to value it in a world that doesn't always make room for it. As the Roman world fades into the background of your mind, you realize that the true beauty of sleep lies not in its perfection, but in its ability to provide moments of peace and recovery, even amid chaos. You close your eyes, finally surrendering to the rhythm of the night, knowing that tomorrow brings new challenges just as it did for the Romans. But for now, sleep calls you softly. You drift deeper into your thoughts, the night's quiet wrapping around you like the gentle Roman breeze you might have felt long ago. The air is still, and your body relaxes further with each passing moment. It's hard not to think of the many ways that life in ancient Rome would have made even the smallest moments of rest feel like a battle. And yet, despite their daily challenges, there were people who somehow managed to sleep in some semblance of comfort. You begin to think about those who had access to slightly better accommodations, perhaps not luxurious by modern standards, but certainly more comfortable than the average Roman. Take the Domus, for example. This was a private Roman home where the upper class would live. It's easy to imagine the difference between their rest and that of the common folk. Wealthy Romans would sleep on beds made from wood or metal frames, perhaps padded with cushions and blankets. The beds in these homes were more likely to be raised from the ground, providing some protection from cold floors. But this doesn't mean the upper classes had it all figured out. In fact, their sleep wasn't necessarily any more restful than that of the poor. It just came with different struggles. In the upper class, they often slept in a triclinia, the Roman dining area that also served as a place to sleep at night. The triclinia was typically furnished with couches where people reclined, eating, talking, and even resting. These couches were made of padded materials and covered with comfortable fabrics, but they were far from the softness and support we are used to today. The pillows used for these couches, though considered luxurious, were often quite thin and uncomfortable. Imagine lying on one of those after a long day. It was a place for resting, but hardly a place for true relaxation. Even the wealthiest Romans still faced the challenge of a less than ideal sleep environment. Their homes, though grand in many ways, still didn't offer the comforts that modern homes do. In fact, the Romans didn't have the luxury of quiet, soundproof rooms or separate bedrooms. It's likely that most people, no matter their social status, slept in communal areas with little to no privacy. This means the rich weren't shielded from the same noises, the same disruptions that the lower classes had to endure. The sound of the streets below, the chatter of workers, or the clamor of animals could easily drift into their homes. And when you think about it, it makes sense why the Romans might have developed such a sophisticated attitude toward rest. It wasn't about finding perfect conditions, it was about getting through the night in whatever way you could. As you settle into your own modern sleep space, it's impossible not to feel a sense of gratitude for the little things we take for granted. For example, temperature control, something the Romans never experienced. While they may have slept in rooms that were drafty or uncomfortably warm, you can adjust your thermostat to create the perfect environment for sleep. No need to worry about shivering in the cold or waking up drenched in sweat. It's a luxury that the ancient Romans could only dream of. Yet, they still managed to sleep in spite of the discomforts, and that speaks to the resilience of the Roman people, finding ways to rest and recharge, no matter how challenging their environment might have been. Historians still argue about whether the Romans had an understanding of sleep cycles, but one thing is certain: they valued sleep as an essential part of life, even if their version of rest was vastly different from what we consider restful today. They may not have known about REM sleep or the benefits of deep, uninterrupted rest, but they did know that sleep was necessary for survival. It wasn't about luxury, it was about maintaining the stamina to continue working and serving the empire. When you think about it, Roman sleep wasn't just a biological necessity, it was an act of endurance. While they may have had a system of public baths that helped them relax during the day, sleep was their nightly ritual to recover and prepare for another day of hard labor. The notion of rest in Roman times was not synonymous with luxury. It was simply a required pause before the relentless cycle of work, duty, and societal expectations. But what about the plebeians? The working class and slaves in Rome had a completely different relationship with sleep, one that was influenced by the demands of their work, which could stretch into long hours of physical labor. They didn't have the privilege of reclining on comfortable couches in spacious homes. Instead, their beds were often nothing more than thin mats on the cold, hard floors. For them, sleep was far more about survival than it was about comfort. And for the slaves, who had little to no control over their schedules, sleep was often stolen during breaks or in whatever rare moments of downtime they could find. You start to realize that no matter what class you belonged to in ancient Rome, sleep was still something to be earned. There was no guaranteed rest, no guaranteed peace of mind, and yet, in the midst of all this chaos and discomfort, people found a way to sleep. Maybe it wasn't restful by today's standards, but sleep was still viewed as a necessary escape, a way to recharge and prepare for the relentless pace of Roman life. As you continue to relax into the quiet of your own room, you reflect on the Romans' unique relationship with sleep, how they didn't view it as an indulgence, but as a means to persevere, to keep pushing through, to survive another day. Perhaps that's the key takeaway here. Rest isn't about perfect conditions, it's about making do with what you have and finding moments of peace even when the world around you is far from peaceful. In that way, the Romans' attitude towards sleep is a reminder that even when things are far from ideal, we can still find ways to rest and recover. You feel a sense of calm as your thoughts drift, knowing that while the world around you might be chaotic, you are in control of your own rest. The Romans may not have had the perfect sleep environments we have today, but they did what they could, and perhaps in a way, they were more resilient because of it. As you settle deeper into the night, your mind starts to wander to the final stretch of Roman life and the concept of nighttime rituals. Unlike the structured modern routines we're so accustomed to, where there are blankets, pillows, and soothing sounds of rain, the Romans had a different approach to evening wind down. In fact, there were no real bedtime routines, at least not in the way we think of them today. Instead, the evening was simply another part of the cycle of labor, where even sleep itself was a transition from one phase of daily activity to another. You think about how today we have a variety of modern sleep aids, scented candles, sound machines, maybe even a warm cup of tea. In contrast, the Romans had to rely on their physical surroundings and rituals to prepare for sleep. They didn't have electric lights to tell them when to go to bed. In fact, the typical Roman day stretched from dawn to dusk, and there wasn't much room for downtime in between. The night wasn't necessarily a time to rest, but a time to pause, an interlude before starting the next day. If you were a wealthy Roman, your evening might have included a final meal, a glass of wine, and perhaps a leisurely walk. This was a time to socialize, reflect on the day, or wind down from the often hectic pace of Roman life. In a way, it was almost a mini celebration of surviving another busy day. But for the working classes, the evening ritual was far less glamorous. After a full day of labor, perhaps toiling in a workshop or working the fields, their nights were spent in simple, modest rest. The lack of a structured bedtime routine wasn't necessarily a sign of neglect, but a reflection of Roman pragmatism. Sleep wasn't something to be ritualized, it was something to be endured. Roman sleep rituals didn't revolve around setting the perfect atmosphere or winding down with calming thoughts. They didn't have a concept of sleep hygiene, no pillow fluffing or lavender essential oils. Instead, their primary concern was simply finding somewhere to sleep that offered enough comfort to allow their bodies to rest. For the wealthy, that meant a soft couch or a raised bed. For the common folk, it could mean lying on the hard floor, or even sleeping outdoors, depending on their circumstances. But whatever their conditions, Romans still viewed sleep as a necessary tool to prepare for the challenges of the next day. You start to realize just how much we take for granted today, how the luxury of preparing for a peaceful night's sleep is almost a given in modern life. Imagine a world where you couldn't rely on a cozy duvet, a comfortable mattress, or the peaceful ambiance of your bedroom. For the Romans, bedtime wasn't about setting the mood. It was about transitioning from one task to another, as sleep itself was a small, fleeting break in an otherwise active life. There was little time to reflect on the day or ease into rest. Sleep simply became the brief window between two periods of work. There's something almost admirable in how the Romans approached the night. They didn't have the luxury of winding down in the same way we do, yet they found ways to make do. Whether they slept in a crowded apartment, a grand domus, or even on the hard, cold ground, they knew that sleep was essential for their endurance. It wasn't about comfort or rituals. It was about getting through the night so they could face another day. It's fascinating to think about how people in that time period understood the necessity of sleep. Even if their physical conditions weren't ideal, they recognized that it was essential, but they didn't glamorize it. They took it as it came. Historians often debate the influence of Roman daily routines on sleep patterns. Some argue that Roman views on sleep were shaped by their pragmatic approach to life. They simply didn't have the time to fuss over the trivialities we associate with bedtime. Others suggest that Romans, despite their austere approach to life, may have developed a unique system of sleep that was far more strategic than we give them credit for. The lack of solid evidence makes it difficult to draw definitive conclusions, but one thing is certain: sleep for the Romans wasn't something to be indulged in. It was something to be used as a tool, a necessary step in an unceasing cycle of work and productivity. Now, as your mind softens with the evening's lull, you can't help but think about how this mindset continues to shape our approach to sleep today. While we may have more comforts and better knowledge of sleep science, we still find ourselves caught in a constant loop of productivity, constantly trying to squeeze more work out of the hours of our day. The Romans might not have had the luxuries we do, but they understood something fundamental about the importance of rest. They knew it was necessary to function, even if it didn't come with the comfort and coziness we have today. As you begin to feel the pull of sleep yourself, you realize that despite the challenges of Roman rest, there was a quiet resilience that defined their approach. Even when the conditions weren't ideal, they found ways to adapt and make do, understanding that rest was an integral part of their ability to keep going. And as you settle in, perhaps you can take a moment to reflect on the ways you too adapt, making the best of what you have to ensure that when you finally rest, you can face the day ahead. The night grows deeper, and your thoughts wander once more toward the heart of Roman society and its intricate yet remarkably practical relationship with sleep. As you begin to feel more relaxed in the comfort of your own surroundings, it's interesting to think about how sleep wasn't just about personal comfort in ancient Rome. It was intertwined with society's needs and expectations. The rhythms of daily life were determined by the clock of necessity rather than the luxury of choice. When you compare your modern life to that of the Romans, it's clear that sleep, while essential for survival, wasn't treated with the same reverence or care we give it today. In Rome, most people didn't sleep in a way that would make today's sleep experts proud. They didn't have dimly lit rooms, soft sheets, or a dark, quiet atmosphere to lull them into rest. The Roman approach to sleep was rooted in the necessities of their time. They worked hard, played hard, and slept when they could. It was a matter of making do. The upper class may have had their cushioned beds and private rooms, but the majority of Romans, the plebeians, the slaves, the workers, had no such luxuries. Sleep for them was often a means of survival, not indulgence. But in Rome, sleep wasn't merely an afternoon luxury. It was a crucial part of daily recovery. Many workers, especially those in the fields or involved in manual labor, would sleep in shifts. The idea of having a long, uninterrupted night of sleep was not always a reality. Instead, sleep was something to be snatched whenever it was possible. In many ways, Roman sleep was a reflection of their worldview. They didn't see rest as an indulgence or something to be prioritized. Instead, it was a functional aspect of life, just as work was. Their nights were structured around the idea that sleep was a tool, not a reward. And when you think about it, this mindset makes sense when you consider the structure of Roman life. The day was a flurry of activity, and there was little time for the personal comforts we associate with modern rest. It was about surviving the day, taking the opportunity to rest when possible, and then doing it all over again. Even within the more structured spaces of Roman homes, sleep wasn't exactly an enjoyable event. The homes of wealthier Romans, with their raised beds and soft linens, were still not as comfortable as our beds today. It's hard not to chuckle at the fact that while they may have had some measure of luxury, they still lacked the simple comforts we take for granted. Beds were often made of hard wooden frames, and even those with cushions or woolen blankets didn't provide the kind of cozy, warm environment we might associate with sleep today. It wasn't a place to unwind after a long day, but simply a place to rest for a few hours before the cycle began again. Historians still argue whether sleep was truly a priority in Roman society. Some suggest that Romans may have viewed sleep as a necessary evil, while others point to evidence suggesting that it was more deeply integrated into daily life than we might expect. The debate continues, but one thing is clear. Even though Roman sleep was far from luxurious, it was something they understood as necessary. They found ways to adapt to the demands of the day, whether it meant sleeping on hard floors, in crowded spaces, or under the open sky. As your thoughts turn toward the final moments of your own night, you can't help but feel thankful for the comforts of the modern world. The luxury of adjusting the temperature, the softness of your blankets, and the quiet stillness that surrounds you is far from the world the Romans inhabited. But there's something humbling in reflecting on their experience of sleep. The Romans may not have had all the modern conveniences, but they found ways to rest, adapt, and continue on. And, in a way, that resilience is something worth carrying with us. The night's quiet settles in deeper now, and as you drift off, perhaps you'll take a moment to appreciate the balance that sleep provides. A balance the Romans understood, even if they didn't have the luxury of the restful nights we're so accustomed to today. Rest is essential after all, and no matter the circumstances, it's something that has remained a constant need throughout history. As the darkness envelops you, your mind gently drifts back to the Roman night, and you begin to feel the subtle threads of history weave together. In these final moments of your journey through the ancient world, it becomes apparent just how crucial sleep was in the Roman psyche, not for its comforts, but for its necessity. When the Romans lay down to rest, it wasn't as though they were indulging in a luxurious escape from their exhausting world. They were simply preparing themselves for the challenges of the next day, accepting that sleep was essential, even if it came with its fair share of discomfort. Thinking back to the humble beginnings of Roman sleep, it's almost remarkable how the simplest rituals carried such weight. The act of lying down on a hard surface, of wrapping oneself in a thin woolen blanket, was not about luxury. It was about survival. The Roman approach to sleep was largely practical, shaped by the rhythms of their daily lives, and it became one of the pillars that allowed them to endure in a world that demanded constant physical and mental exertion. They didn't have the time or energy to overthink the process of winding down at night. They didn't have fluffy pillows, gentle music, or warm, inviting beds. They had what they needed to rest enough to face another day, and in that simplicity, they thrived. As you reflect on your own modern experience of rest, there's a certain respect that you feel for the Romans' resilience. They weren't worried about creating the perfect sleep environment or making sure every possible factor was conducive to a peaceful night. Their goal was simple: sleep just enough to be able to rise, be functional, and get through another demanding day. While they may not have had the luxury of comfort, they understood one simple truth: sleep was an essential foundation for surviving the challenges of the day. In their eyes, it wasn't about the quality of the sleep, but about finding the time to rest, even for just a few precious hours. Now, as you prepare to slip further into sleep, you can't help but feel that same sense of quiet resilience. We may have modern conveniences, but there's something to be learned from the Roman perspective. Sleep doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to happen, because with it comes the strength to continue on. So, as you close your eyes, perhaps it's a good time to reflect on the simplicity of rest, and how even in the absence of comfort, rest is still a vital necessity. Roman life, with all its struggles and imperfections, reminds us that sleep, though often overlooked in its simplicity, is foundational. It allows us to reset, recharge, and move forward into the next chapter of our lives. And just as the Romans understood their need for rest, we too can appreciate the quiet moments of recovery that bring us back to life each day. As the world outside your window quiets and the stars slowly fade into the background of your mind, you can begin to let go of your thoughts. The night is a constant, just as it was in Rome. Whether it was spent on a hard floor, under the open sky, or on a soft Roman couch, sleep was the great equalizer. And now, as the day fades into memory, sleep carries you away, into a place where time is not counted and comfort is a gentle luxury. So as you drift into the quiet embrace of rest, let the rhythmic pace of the night, much like the Romans, soothe you. There's no rush, no need for perfection, just the quiet peace that comes with the knowledge that rest in all its simplicity is enough.